New York City, April 1967. The Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom sparkled under magnificent crystal chandeliers as the entertainment industry's most compassionate figures gathered for the annual Children's Charity Gala. 250 of Hollywood and Broadway's biggest names filled every table, from film legends to television's brightest stars, all assembled to raise funds for children's hospitals worldwide. At table 16 sat Dick Van Dyke, relaxed and genuine in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, that infectious smile brightening conversations with Julie Andrews, Angela Lansbury, and Fred Astaire as they discussed their various charitable endeavors. The evening should have been pure celebration for Dick. The Dick Van Dyke Show was concluding its legendary run on the highest note possible, cementing Dick's reputation as television's premier physical comedian. His charity work with children's hospitals had become as renowned as his entertainment career, with Dick quietly donating millions and spending countless hours visiting young patients. But across the ballroom, holding court at the head table like a king presiding over his charitable kingdom, sat Danny Kaye. Danny was entertainment royalty, a multi-talented performer who had dominated films throughout the 1940s and 1950s, with his unique blend of physical comedy, vocal virtuosity, and manic energy. His work with UNICEF had made him an international humanitarian icon, earning him recognition from world leaders and making him the public face of celebrity charity work. Danny's performances for children around the globe had become legendary, and his dedication to humanitarian causes was unquestioned. But Danny was also a perfectionist with a legendary ego, someone who didn't easily share the spotlight or acknowledge other performers working in what he considered his territory. And lately, he'd been watching Dick Van Dyke's rise with growing irritation. The problem wasn't just Dick's success, it was the nature of that success. Dick's physical comedy style bore certain similarities to Danny's approach: the pratfalls, the musical numbers, the ability to make audiences laugh through pure physicality and charm. To Danny's mind, Dick was essentially doing a watered-down television version of what Danny had perfected in films decades earlier. Moreover, Dick's charity work was beginning to receive the kind of recognition that Danny felt belonged exclusively to established humanitarian celebrities like himself. Dick's hospital visits were making headlines, his donations were being praised by medical professionals, and his approach to child-focused charity was being called innovative and heartfelt. Danny had been drinking moderately throughout the elegant dinner, his famous intensity slightly amplified by alcohol and the growing realization that his monopoly on certain types of entertainment and humanitarian work was being challenged by this television newcomer. Dick, meanwhile, was genuinely enjoying the evening. He felt honored to be among entertainment legends, grateful for the opportunity to contribute to children's causes, and excited about the impact their collective efforts could have. When people mentioned Danny Kaye, Dick spoke with enormous respect about the older performer's contributions to entertainment and humanitarian work, about how Danny had shown that celebrities could use their platform for genuine good. But Danny interpreted Dick's presence and success differently. What Danny saw was a television performer who had built his career by copying techniques that Danny had pioneered, someone who was receiving credit for innovation when he was really just adapting Danny's approach to a different medium. The formal program began at 9 o'clock with presentations recognizing various performers' charitable contributions. Elizabeth Taylor received thunderous applause for her hospital work. Frank Sinatra was honored for his youth programs, and the atmosphere remained warm and inspiring. When Dick was called to present an award for innovation in celebrity charity work, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dick began, his voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom, "tonight we're celebrating something beautiful. The idea that those of us fortunate enough to have public platforms have a responsibility to use those platforms for good." He paused, looking around at faces that had shaped both entertainment and humanitarian work for decades. "When I started visiting children's hospitals, I wasn't trying to be innovative or groundbreaking. I was just following the example set by performers like Danny Kaye, who showed us that making children smile isn't just good publicity, It's good for the soul. Dick's speech was generous and humble, acknowledging the pioneering work of established humanitarian celebrities. The beautiful thing about charitable work, Dick continued, is that there's no competition. There's no such thing as too many celebrities caring about children, too many performers visiting hospitals, too many famous faces bringing joy to young patients. The need is so great that all of us together are barely making a dent in what needs to be done. Danny's table had gone quiet. Several people glanced at him, trying to gauge his reaction to being mentioned with such obvious admiration. What I've learned from legends like Danny Kaye, Dick concluded, is that real charity work isn't about the celebrity, it's about the children. It's not about how we look or what credit we get. It's about showing up, being present, and reminding young people that they matter to someone, even if that someone is just a guy from television who wants them to know they're not alone. Dick received warm applause and returned to his table as the evening continued. But Danny's mood had darkened considerably. Being mentioned in Dick's speech felt patronizing to him, as if this television newcomer was graciously acknowledging the real humanitarian celebrities while positioning himself as their worthy successor. As the formal program ended and people began to mingle, Danny's careful public persona began to slip. He stood from the head table, with the measured precision of someone who'd had enough to drink to lower his inhibitions, but was determined to maintain his dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Danny called out, his voice cutting through the ballroom conversations with that commanding presence that had captivated audiences for decades. "May I have your attention for just a moment?" The room gradually quieted as people turned to see what the legendary Danny Kaye wanted to say. Dick looked up from his conversation with Julie Andrews, curious but not concerned. "I want to address something that's been on my mind tonight," Danny continued, his voice carrying that intensity that could fill a concert hall. "We've heard beautiful speeches about innovation in charity work, about following examples set by established performers, about building on foundations laid by others." Several people nodded approvingly. This sounded like it might be a thoughtful reflection from one of entertainment's great humanitarians. "But I think we need to be honest about something," Danny said, his tone beginning to edge towards something more pointed. "There's a difference between being inspired by someone's work and simply copying it. There's a difference between building on a foundation and just taking credit for someone else's blueprint." The room was beginning to sense tension in Danny's words. "Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone," Danny continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but I think it's important that we maintain some perspective about what genuine innovation actually looks like versus what's just successful imitation." Danny began to pace slightly as he spoke, his movements sharp and theatrical. "Take Dick Van Dyke, for example," Danny said, gesturing toward Dick's table with a flourish that felt more accusatory than acknowledging. "Everyone's praising his charity work, calling it innovative, talking about his unique approach to helping children." The ballroom went completely silent. People stopped drinking, stopped talking, stopped moving as they realized they were about to witness a public confrontation. But let's be honest about what Dick Van Dyke actually represents. Danny continued, his voice getting sharper and more cutting. "Dick is a cheap imitator. He's taken the approach to children's charity that I developed 20 years ago and repackaged it for television audiences." Dick's face remained composed, but something in his eyes was beginning to change. "Has Dick Van Dyke created anything original in his approach to helping children?" Danny asked rhetorically. "Has he developed new techniques for connecting with young patients? Has he pioneered innovative methods for using celebrity status to benefit humanitarian causes?" Danny's voice was getting more theatrical, more condescending. "The answer is no. Dick Van Dyke has watched what I've been doing with UNICEF and children's hospitals for decades, copied my methods, and then received praise for innovations when he's really just doing a television version of work I pioneered in the 1940s. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This had crossed from industry commentary into personal attack territory. "Dick Van Dyke's charity work is very nice," Danny said with dismissive laughter. "He shows up at hospitals, makes children laugh. writes some checks. But that's not innovation. That's imitation. That's taking a proven formula developed by someone else and claiming credit for creativity. Danny looked directly at Dick. So when I hear people praising Dick for his charitable innovation, when I see him receiving awards for humanitarian work, I have to speak up. Because real innovation requires real creativity, real risk, real pioneering work. And Dick Van Dyke is just a cheap imitator who happened to have a television show that made his copying more visible. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in that ballroom had ever experienced. 250 people held their breath, waiting to see how Dick Van Dyke would respond to this devastating public attack. Dick stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent room. "Danny," Dick said simply, "are you finished?" "I'm finished when someone acknowledges the difference between real humanitarian work and just copying what others have already perfected," Danny replied, his voice still carrying that distinctive energy but with an edge of bitterness. Dick walked to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His movement was confident, unhurried, like a man who knew exactly what he intended to say. "All right," Dick said, his voice growing stronger. "Let's talk about innovation versus imitation. Let's talk about what it means to help children versus using children to help yourself. And let's talk about the difference between being a humanitarian and just playing one for publicity." Danny crossed his arms, his expression suggesting he was prepared for whatever defense Dick might offer. "Danny, you called me a cheap imitator," Dick continued. "You suggested that I've copied your methods, that I've received undeserved credit for charitable innovation, that my work with children is just a television version of what you pioneered decades ago." Dick looked around the room, making eye contact with various humanitarian celebrities. "Those are serious accusations, and I think everyone here deserves to understand what they really mean." Dick turned back to Danny, his voice becoming more pointed. "First, let's talk about what children's charity actually requires. You're absolutely right that you pioneered celebrity humanitarian work. You showed that famous people could use their platform to help children, to raise awareness for important causes, to make a real difference in young lives. That's remarkable work that I deeply admire." Several people in the audience began nodding. "But Danny, charity work isn't about who did it first. It's about who does it best. And more importantly, it's about who does it for the right reasons." Dick's voice was gaining strength and moral authority. "You want to talk about innovation, Danny? Real innovation in charity work isn't about developing new methods. It's about genuinely caring more about the children than about the recognition you get for helping them." The room was completely focused on Dick now. "And that's what really bothers you, isn't it, Danny? It's not that I'm copying your methods. It's that people are noticing that my motivations might be different from yours." Dick walked closer to Danny, his voice becoming more intimate but somehow more commanding. "You want to talk about real charity work, Danny? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what happened at Mount Sinai Hospital last year." Danny's face began to change color. "Tell them about Sarah Morrison, Danny," Dick said quietly. Several people in the audience leaned forward, clearly recognizing this reference but unsure of the details. "No? You don't want to tell them?" Dick asked. "Then I will." Dick turned to address the room. Last December, Danny was doing one of his famous hospital visits at Mount Sinai Children's Ward. Cameras present, reporters taking notes, the full UNICEF publicity treatment. He was visiting a 7-year-old girl named Sarah Morrison who was recovering from heart surgery. Dick's voice was getting harder now. Sarah was a huge fan. She'd watched Danny's movies, practiced singing his songs, and was more excited about meeting him than anything that had happened during her entire hospital stay. Audible gasps came from several people in the audience. But when Danny arrived for his scheduled visit, Sarah was having a bad day. She was in pain, she was scared, and she started crying when the cameras came into her room. Danny was now visibly uncomfortable, and Danny's response was to tell the hospital staff that he couldn't do his visit with a crying child because it would ruin the photo opportunity. He said that Sarah needed to pull herself together if she wanted to meet him. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. A 7-year-old girl who was recovering from heart surgery was told she needed to stop crying if she wanted to meet her hero. Dick continued, his voice getting more passionate. When Sarah couldn't stop crying because she was 7 years old and scared and in pain, Danny left. He went to visit other children who were having better days, children who would make better photographs. Dick's voice was getting louder, more commanding. Sarah Morrison spent the rest of her hospital stay believing that Danny Kaye didn't want to meet her because she wasn't good enough, because she couldn't stop being scared when strangers with cameras came into her room. Dick walked closer to Danny. But here's what really shows your character, Danny. When the hospital staff asked if you'd consider coming back to visit Sarah on a day when she was feeling better, when there were no cameras and no publicity, you said no. You said you'd already fulfilled your commitments to Mount Sinai. The room was absolutely riveted. You want to know how I found out about Sarah Morrison, Danny? Because her mother wrote to me 6 months later. She'd heard that I visited children's hospitals, and she wanted to know if I'd be willing to meet Sarah, to help her understand that not all celebrities would abandon her when she needed them most. Dick paused, letting his words sink in. So I went to see Sarah, not with cameras, not with reporters, not for publicity. I went because a 7-year-old girl needed to know that someone cared about her, whether she was crying or smiling, whether she was photogenic or not, whether meeting her would help my image or hurt it. Dick looked around the room one final time. You called me a cheap imitator, Danny. But the real difference between us isn't in our methods. It's in our motivations. I help children because they need help. You help children when it helps you. The silence that followed was deafening. Danny Kaye stood there, his face a mixture of rage, humiliation, and something that might have been recognition of the truth. Then something happened that no one in that ballroom expected. Danny's legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees. At first, people thought he was having some kind of medical episode. Several people moved to help him. But then they realized what was happening. Danny Kaye was kneeling, deliberately, in front of Dick Van Dyke, in front of 250 people. You're right, Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. God help me, you're right. Dick looked down at this legendary figure on his knees. This man who had brought joy to millions of children, now reduced to a broken person confronting his own failures. Danny, Dick said gently, get up. I can't, Danny said, tears beginning to stream down his face. I can't get up. What I did to Sarah, to all the children I disappointed because they weren't convenient for my image. I never thought about what my selfishness was doing to them. Yes, you did, Dick said quietly. You knew exactly what you were doing. But Danny, that doesn't mean you can't choose to do better. Dick knelt down beside Danny, bringing himself to eye level. The question isn't whether you've used your humanitarian work for personal gain, Dick said. The question is what you're going to do now. Danny looked at Dick through his tears. How can I fix this? How can I make it right with Sarah? With all the children I let down because I cared more about my reputation than their feelings. You start by acknowledging what you did, Dick said. You stop using charity work to build your image and start using your image to do genuine charity work. You choose to care about the children more than you care about the credit. Danny nodded shakily. I will. I swear I will. Don't swear to me, Dick said. Swear to Sarah Morrison. Swear to every child who's ever been disappointed by a celebrity who put publicity ahead of compassion. Dick helped Danny to his feet. The room watched in amazement as the two performers stood facing each other. I need to call Mount Sinai, Danny said, his voice stronger now. I need to see if Sarah will let me visit her properly this time. Yes, you do, Dick agreed. But Danny, when you visit her, don't bring cameras. Don't bring reporters. Don't bring anything except genuine care for a little girl who deserved better from you the first time. Danny turned to address the room, his voice shaking but clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an enormous apology. I owe Dick Van Dyke an enormous apology. And I owe Sarah Morrison and every child I've disappointed the biggest apology of my life. Danny's voice got stronger as he continued. I came here tonight thinking I was defending the integrity of celebrity humanitarian work, but I was really just protecting my own ego, my own territory, my own image. Dick Van Dyke didn't need to be torn down for me to maintain my reputation. His genuine care for children didn't diminish my legacy. My own selfishness did that. Danny looked directly at Dick. You're not a cheap imitator. You're a genuine humanitarian who understands that charity work is about the people you help, not the credit you receive. Everything I forgot in my pursuit of recognition and awards. The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone had heard at a charity event. It wasn't just appreciation for entertainment, it was recognition of genuine human transformation happening in real time. Danny turned back to the audience one final time. I'm going to do better. I'm going to use whatever celebrity I have left to actually help children instead of helping myself. And I'm going to spend whatever time I have remaining trying to earn the forgiveness I don't deserve. Over the next several weeks, the story dominated entertainment news. But the real story wasn't about humiliation or public confrontation. The real story was about accountability, change, and the possibility that even the most celebrated humanitarians could learn to be more human. Danny did call Mount Sinai. He arranged to visit Sarah Morrison privately, with no cameras and no publicity. The visit lasted 3 hours, and Sarah's mother later said it was the first time she'd seen her daughter completely happy since her surgery. More importantly, Danny changed his approach to all his charitable work, focusing on the children's needs rather than his own image. Dick, for his part, continued to be exactly who he'd always been, gracious, humble, and genuinely caring. But he'd also shown that defending children sometimes means confronting adults who claim to help them, but really help themselves. Years later, Sarah Morrison, now grown, spoke at a charity event where both Dick and Danny were being honored. Her words captured the real lesson of that night at the Waldorf Astoria. Both of these men taught me something important about heroes. Mr. K taught me that even heroes can make mistakes, but real heroes admit their mistakes and work to fix them. Van Dyke taught me that the best heroes are the ones who care more about helping you than about looking heroic themselves. The story of Danny Kaye calling Dick Van Dyke a cheap imitator became more than just an entertainment industry anecdote. It became a template for accountability in charitable work, proving that even the most celebrated humanitarian efforts need to be examined for genuine motivation versus personal gain. Dick Van Dyke's calm response didn't just put Danny Kaye on his knees, it put him on a path to becoming the genuine humanitarian he'd always claimed to be, but had never actually become. That's the real power of standing up for what's right. Sometimes the people who need it most are those who think they're already doing everything right. But the transformation that began that night at the Waldorf Astoria had consequences that reached far beyond the entertainment industry. Danny's commitment to genuine charity work became a model for how celebrities could use their platforms responsibly, focusing on impact rather than image. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Danny called Mount Sinai personally and spoke with Sarah Morrison's mother. The conversation was emotional and healing. Danny didn't just apologize, he listened as Mrs. Morrison explained how his rejection had affected Sarah's recovery and self-esteem. Sarah believed she wasn't good enough for you, Mrs. Morrison told him. She thought that being scared and crying made her unworthy of meeting her hero. It took months for her to understand that her feelings were normal and that she didn't need to be perfect to deserve kindness. Danny absorbed every word without defending himself. When Mrs. Morrison finished, he said simply, "I was wrong. I put my image ahead of your daughter's feelings, and that's unforgivable. But if Sarah would let me, I'd like to visit her properly this time." The visit happened 2 weeks later. Danny arrived alone, with no cameras, no reporters, no publicity team. He spent 3 hours with Sarah, playing games, singing songs, and most importantly, apologizing for making her feel inadequate when she was just being a scared 7-year-old. "I want you to know something," Danny told Sarah during their visit. "When you were crying that day, you weren't doing anything wrong. You were just being honest about how you felt. And that takes courage. I was the one who was wrong for not understanding that." Sarah, now 8 and fully recovered, looked at him with the direct honesty that only children possess. "Are you going to be nicer to other kids now?" "Yes," Danny promised. "I'm going to try to be the person you thought I was before I disappointed you." Word of Danny's transformation spread throughout the charity community. Other celebrity humanitarians began examining their own motivations, asking themselves whether they were truly helping others or primarily helping their own images. The incident also changed how charitable organizations worked with celebrity ambassadors. Mount Sinai Hospital implemented new guidelines requiring that all celebrity visits focus on the children's needs rather than publicity opportunities. Other hospitals followed suit, creating protocols that protected young patients from being used as props for celebrity image building. In 1969, 2 years after the Waldorf confrontation, Danny was invited to speak at a conference on celebrity involvement in humanitarian work. His speech became legendary in nonprofit circles for its brutal honesty about the temptations of ego-driven charity. "I spent 20 years believing that my celebrity gave me the right to help children on my own terms," Danny told the assembled charity workers. "I thought that showing up was enough, that my presence was the gift regardless of how that presence affected the children I was supposedly helping." Danny looked out at the audience of nonprofit professionals and healthcare workers. "But Dick Van Dyke taught me that celebrity is a tool, not an entitlement. It's something you use to serve others, not something that makes others serve your needs. When I demanded that sick children perform happiness for my cameras, I wasn't being charitable. I was being selfish with a charitable disguise." The conference led to the development of what became known as the K Protocol, a set of guidelines for celebrity involvement in children's charities that prioritized the children's welfare over publicity opportunities. The protocol was adopted by hundreds of organizations and became the standard for responsible celebrity humanitarian work. Dick's approach to charity work also evolved after the confrontation, though in his case, the changes were more about scale than substance. Inspired by the response to his defense of Sarah Morrison, Dick began advocating more actively for systemic changes in how celebrity charity was conducted. In 1970, Dick established the Morrison Foundation, named after Sarah with her family's permission, which provided funding for child-focused charities while requiring that all celebrity involvement follow strict ethical guidelines. The foundation's motto became "Impact over Image," and it quickly became a model for how entertainment industry philanthropy could operate with genuine integrity. The friendship that developed between Dick and Danny became one of Hollywood's most unexpected partnerships. They began appearing together at charity events, with Danny often introducing Dick as the man who taught me the difference between helping children and using children. Their collaboration resulted in some of the most successful fundraising efforts in charitable history. Danny's established connections combined with Dick's principled approach created a new model for celebrity humanitarian work that focused entirely on outcomes rather than recognition. In 1972, when the Morrison Foundation was hosting its annual fundraising gala, Sarah Morrison herself, now 13, was invited to speak. Her words captured the lasting impact of the changes that had begun that night at the Waldorf. "When I was little and sick, I thought celebrities were like magic people who could make everything better just by showing up," Sarah told the audience. "But I learned that the real magic happens when famous people remember that children are real people with real feelings, not just opportunities for good pictures." She looked at both Dick and Danny, who were sitting together at the head table. "Mr. K hurt my feelings when I was 7. But then he came back and showed me that people can change when they realize they've been wrong. Mr. Van Dyke stood up for kids like me even when it was hard. Both of them taught me that real heroes aren't perfect. They're just people who care more about doing right than looking good." When Danny Kaye died in 1987, Dick Van Dyke spoke at his memorial service. The eulogy was remarkable for its focus not on Danny's entertainment legacy, but on his transformation as a humanitarian. Danny Kaye made mistakes, Dick told the assembled crowd of entertainment and charity figures. He hurt children he was trying to help, used charity work to build his image, and confused being celebrated for being good. But what made Danny special wasn't that he was perfect, it was that he was willing to change. Dick looked out at the audience, seeing faces of performers and charity workers who had been influenced by Danny's later example. The last 20 years of Danny's life were about redemption, about using his celebrity responsibly, about proving that even established humanitarian celebrities can learn to do better. He showed us that admitting you've been wrong isn't the end of your charitable career. It's the beginning of your genuine humanitarian work. As Dick concluded his eulogy, he offered a final thought that captured the real lesson of that night 20 years earlier. Danny taught me that defending children isn't just about protecting them from obvious harm. It's about protecting them from being used, even by well-meaning adults who think their good intentions excuse their selfish methods. Real child advocacy sometimes means confronting the very people who claim to be helping children the most. The story of Danny Kaye calling Dick Van Dyke a cheap imitator had become more than just an entertainment industry anecdote. It had become a template for accountability in humanitarian work, proving that even the most celebrated charitable efforts needed to be examined for genuine motivation and real impact. Dick Van Dyke's calm response didn't just put Danny Kaye on his knees. It put the entire celebrity charity industry on notice that good intentions weren't enough, that helping others required genuine care rather than just publicity opportunities. That's the real power of standing up for vulnerable people. It doesn't just protect them in the moment. It creates standards that protect countless others who might never know they needed protecting. Sarah Morrison, now a pediatric nurse herself, still keeps in touch with both the Morrison Foundation and Mount Sinai Hospital. She often tells young patients that the most important thing about meeting celebrities isn't getting a good picture. It's feeling like the celebrity actually sees you as a person worth knowing, whether you're having a good day or a bad one. And that lesson, born from one night's confrontation at a charity gala, continues to shape how celebrity humanitarian work operates today. Because sometimes the most charitable thing you can do is refuse to let charity become about anything other than the people it's supposed to serve.